Hello, everyone. It's Dan Sandhu again. I'm the CEO of Sparx. And as we've had conversations before around what's happening in the ecosystem, we're having another one today. This series of discussions helps us look at what's happening in the education ecosystem, implications of COVID, challenges ahead from all aspects. And as you'll see from the series, from the discussions I've had and I'm going to have, this covers everything from investment to education, policy making, international, and today it's the turn of assessment. Joining me today is Matt Wingfield. Matt is the CEO of the eassessment Association and an EdTech consultant as well. Hi, Matt.
Hi, Dan.
Matt, I'm going to fire a few questions at you, and so let's just keep the kind of discussion going. We may go off on a tangent, but to kick off, could you introduce yourself and just tell us a bit about the eassessment Association?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Matt Wingfield, as you said, Chief Executive of the eassessment Association, and then also an independent consultant. And I've been associated with the eassessment Association since almost the beginning. The association was founded in 2008, and I joined in 2010. Became chairman in 2012 and I'm now chief executive, as you say. So the association is really, it's quite simply, I suppose, it's all about propagating and supporting the best use of technology in all forms of assessment, whether that's summative exams or formative learning progression, and right across the education spectrum from schools through to professional and work-based learning. We've got about 3,000 members now. We're based in the UK, but our membership comes from all parts of the world, and we're supported by about 30 commercial organisations now who fund the activity that we undertake, which ranges from running an annual conference, which we held in central London back in June, through to an annual awards program, and then various webinars and podcasts and other ways of interacting with the market and propagating understanding of what's possible and examples of best practice within the market.
Brilliant. And how, I mean, the obvious question is, how is eassessment, what happened during COVID? Let's just start with that. What happened around eassessment during COVID, during the time of either lockdowns or general just change in the environment in education?
Well, obviously, like many parts of the education spectrum, there was a very profound impact. I think it depends on the sector that you're looking at as to what the impact was, or at least how that sector reacted. Everyone suffered a similar impact in that formal assessments couldn't take place, and obviously the whole of the education system went online. I think the assessment landscape followed in differing ways. So if we look at and talk about schools for a second, as we're aware, I'm sure, the school exam approach was shut down, stopped for 2 years, and we went back to reverting to teacher-assessed grades and centre-assessed grades, which was interesting from my perspective because, as you know, I started my career as a teacher. And back then, in the dim and distant past, that's what we did. We did teacher-assessed grades all the time and teacher-assessed progression of students. But obviously, that's not the norm now. And I think that threw the schools into a little bit of a tailspin. But they sorted that out. And actually, I think the teacher-assessed grades and the centre-assessed grades came out very positively in the grand scheme of things overall. Other sectors reacted differently. Further education, higher education started implementing online assessments. Professional assessment just switched wholesale to online assessment. Many of them had already been thinking about it.
And this is membership organisations or professional chartered accountancy institutes?
Yes, that kind of thing. But also, vocational qualifications assessment as well. So if you're training to be a hairdresser or a bricklayer or whatever, a lot of the assessments switched to being online. And actually, I think a lot of the positive momentum for that has continued as we move forward, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about the future implications as we move forward. But that sector, vocational and professional learning, really embraced this digital education. The more formal the education model, schools, colleges and universities, the more resistance there was to that change. And so some have now gone back to the way they were doing it before. But there was definitely change, and online assessment featured heavily in that change.
And what are the implications? I mean, what I know there's a groundswell of enthusiasm for general ed tech adoption during COVID, and you're right. Some areas have continued and some areas haven't. But in terms of assessment, what are the implications going forward?
That's a really good question, again, I think it varies by sector. I think if we stay focused on schools for a minute, there's been a huge surge of interest in trying to come up with a model that embraces. I'm going to try and avoid saying, although I have online assessment, because it doesn't have to be online, on screen, online, but digital assessment, because it provides such great resilience in time of challenge, like as we found in the pandemic, but also because it offers opportunity for great innovation within what we're assessing. Because if we think about it, our GCSE and A-level assessment models in the UK haven't really changed very much since the early 20th century, industrialized market model serving that sort of pipeline of getting people into work when people left school at 16.
That's right, yeah.
Technology provides many different opportunities for that. So yes, there's been increased interest in it. We've seen just last month, AQA, one of the big awarding bodies, published a research paper where they engaged with the market to understand appetite of teachers and students. Overwhelmingly positive, by the way, to the idea of moving to more digital assessment. But there are challenges too. Digital inequalities, access to digital devices, both at home and at school. So I think there's lots of opportunity in the school space. What we really need is a well thought through national plan to move this forward, which is not only well thought through and staged over a period of time, but also funded critically.
I know. I mean, as Sparx, as everyone knows, is in the school space, so I could really dig deep and dwell on that. But just have a look at the overall the sector as a whole. What were the differences in terms of, we've talked a bit about schools. What about further education, higher education? And has adoption been more stickier post-COVID?
I think it has, more so than schools, for sure. But I think it sort of graduates as you move away from the schools market through further and higher and then into the workplace. The further you go along that path, the stickier it has become. Okay. So colleges and FE institutions do a lot of online, both learning and assessment already, and they have done for a little while, particularly in some of the vocational subjects. And that has stuck, but you could argue that there hasn't been huge change there. Okay. HE have embraced digital for a long time too, mostly in the learning space. And when it came to assessment, it was a case of going and sitting in an exam room and writing on a piece of paper for a few hours. Some of the universities were forced to change that model. Other universities resisted the change, and other universities have made the change and then gone back again. Okay. Part of the problem is it's a generational thing in terms of the lecturers, the academics' understanding of what's possible, and a slight resistance to changing away from what they know, I guess. But
I suppose that cuts both ways. If they're satisfied with the outcome and the resistance to change, the adoption will be higher. I suppose once it's there.
What was interesting in reading going back to schools briefly, the AQA report, actually, they canvassed opinion across a range of age demographics in terms of educators, and actually there wasn't a huge difference. Okay. So those teachers from an older generation were equally enthusiastic about the idea of implementing online exams because they could see the positive benefit for the students. I think the slight difference with HE is because HE lecturers aren't just teachers, they're academics, they're researchers. They want to find models that work across all of their commitment landscape, and reinventing the wheel to move to online is difficult when you're being pulled into, you're time poor and you're trying to do other stuff too.
I mean, moving back to K-12, in the last, and I can't remember quite when, there was a note out from Ofqual talking about the potential of future qualifications, including GCSE, being online, the exams themselves. What are the thoughts about that, and what are the implications for the industry on that?
So this was part of their 2022-2025
That's right, yes.
Strategy. I think the focus there, I think it's important to understand that the focus was very much about introducing innovation. And digital technologies were mentioned, but as an enabler to that innovation rather than being the main focus. So Ofqual have always been very positive about supporting innovation in the assessment sector, but they've never really been very good at proactively telling everybody that. So I think inwardly they've always wanted to see innovation, but it's been difficult. It's a challenging place for a regulator to strike a balance there. So they've always been very supportive of it, but I think it's important to note that it's not just Ofqual. Of course, the other three regulators in the UK, SEA in Northern Ireland, SQA in Scotland, and Qualifications Wales in Wales, they're all supportive of moving to more digital. I think the Welsh example is an interesting one. So they have a similar strategy to Ofqual to modernise assessment in Wales. That's their terminology. But it's not just them doing it in isolation. So they're supported by the Welsh government, who've invested somewhere in the region of £160 million in improving digital infrastructure to schools. So that not only within the school, but getting internet access to the schools, because bearing in mind that, like many areas of the UK, Wales has some challenging geographic locations to overcome. So they've invested heavily in that. They've also invested heavily, as part of that amount of money, in modernising the approach to national tests in Wales, so that primary school students and Key Stage 3 students are now using technology for assessment as part of their everyday learning and teaching and learning. And so that sort of sets the scene to then be able to enable change in an assessment from an assessment perspective. And that perhaps is where England needs to go next. We need to think about, so talking about the implications of Ofqual's suggestion, we have to think about how we enable that move. And that's both from a digital enablement, we need investment into connectivity, we need investment into devices particularly, both at the school and at home. But we also need to look at the curriculum and see how we need to adapt that curriculum to support those students going into a digital assessment.
I suppose that leads on to my next question in terms of whether awarding bodies are playing a role in this. Because there's one thing the regulators talking about it, the another thing the awarding bodies, which the schools sign up to, taking an active role in that. What's your sense of that?
So I think it's really interesting. I think that they have become more openly active in this space in the last 5 or 6 years. But the most innovation in that space has again happened in the professional learning space and in the vocational work-based sector. Organisations, awarding organisations like City and Guilds, who are very well known in the vocational space, they've been using technology to support assessment for a long time.
Indeed, both you and I both know that.
Indeed,
we've worked together before.
And using technologies like e-portfolios and others to assess practical and soft skills.
Yeah.
General awarding bodies, so those supporting GCSEs and A-levels, have been slower to adapt to it, but they've been working away in the background at looking at how they might do this. I think what's interesting is, since Ofqual and Qualifications Wales and SQA and SEA to a lesser extent have come out more openly and said, we're happy with this, we want you to innovate, more of those general qualification awarding bodies have started to do that. So AQA, in addition to that research paper, they're also proposing pilots in GCSE online assessment. OCR, Cambridge Assessment, Pearson at Excel have been making similar noises. So I think they are all starting to jump into this openly now. So I think all of them have been working away at this in the background, but they've been nervous about making too much public noise about it, because I think there's been a concerned that the market doesn't really want it yet. But I think the pandemic's got rid of that concern, and people have seen the benefits.
That's really interesting because it's like a chicken and egg situation in terms of vicious circle, schools adoption versus awarding bodies insisting. There's going to be some challenges. I know at Sparx we're always looking at what's happening inside a school environment. Given our focus on homework as well, home environment. So things like the lack of digital devices could be a restriction in the mass qualification market. I get that.
Yes.
I don't know how the awarding bodies would tackle schools coming back and saying we just don't have enough devices.
Well, see, again, I suppose that takes me back to a key point in all of this is that government's got to get on board with this. The market is going to need some support financially and strategically in order to make the move.
Yeah.
I think there's a few things we could do. The first is we need to make sure that all of our students have got access to the devices they need in order to be able to take their assessments. Through the pandemic, many students received support from their schools. Obviously, not every school was able to do that. Yeah. The Multi-Academy Trusts did a really good job on the whole of supporting student access at home. But it costs money, and we need government to step in and support that. And I think it would be unfair to expect the awarding bodies to, because they're not really in a position to do that.
I understand. So this is trying to figure out how the change is going to happen. And I suspect there'll be some step changes and steps to make sure this happens. In terms of your understanding of the international market, where does the UK fare compared to international markets around online assessment or the e-assessment market itself?
I think, again, sound a bit like a stuck record here, it depends on the sector. Yeah. I think in terms of professional and work-based learning, we're pretty much on a par. And in some places, we're probably leading a little bit of that because the use of e-assessment and digital technologies has been so much more a part of the assessment landscape there for a while. As you come down, so you start to see the UK falling behind. So universities, still strong, but if you look at Australia, many universities in Australia have been using a mixed approach of digital and face-to-face teaching, learning and assessment for many years. At the conference, the assessment conference, a couple of months ago, we had a lecturer talking from Deakin University in Australia, and he was saying that when he did his degree, there were elements of it that were assessed digitally. So this was some 20 years ago. So they're much further ahead of the curve, and I think you see that all the way through then from colleges into schools. I think there are some really interesting examples internationally of if we focus on sort of school leaving exams, GCSE equivalents, and they vary in the approaches they've taken. So if we start from the example that's often cited is Finland. The Finnish education system is ahead of us in many respects, and that doesn't discount assessment. The government there took a strategic decision to make all school leaving exams online, and they have now successfully implemented that. It was a 3-year staggered program that finished in 2019. So now all school leaving exams are online. Slight difference in that they don't have GCSEs, they don't assess at 16, they only assess at 18, but they are their school leaving exams and they're all delivered online. Other examples, so Egypt has recently gone through a bit of a transformation here. Again, big central government investment, making sure that all students had access to devices. And Pearson then delivered their platform in Egypt to deliver all of their exams. But interestingly there, it wasn't so much about the ability to have remote assessment. All of the students are still coming into exam halls, but they're sitting the exams digitally. And then you've got other examples. So New Zealand, they embarked on their digital transformation journey back in 2015, but they've taken a rather different route, and they're taking a parallel optional route that says paper exams still exist, and if you want to take a digital version and it's available, you can. Now, many people say that one of the challenges with that, and indeed New Zealand's found this, is that adoption is much, much slower because people stick with what they know for longer.
Yeah.
But it is starting to succeed.
Yeah.
About 2/3 of their schools now are now using online exams, but not for everything, just for a handful of subjects. I think my advice in terms of how you implement this kind of stuff is that a staged model is better rather than a big bang switch over or a parallel model as is happening in New Zealand, because it allows you to start small and grow and learn from what you do, but as part of a strategic plan that has a clear, defined end date.
It's fascinating. I think that's quite interesting. I think the audience would love to, that's actually probably really interesting for the audience to realise how, while everything stays the same, lots of things are moving at different paces. And it'd be fascinating to see if boards and schools and governments actually look to see what's happening in other countries. We tend not to sometimes watch what other countries do. Maybe it's intellectual arrogance, maybe it's just laziness on part of various parts of the education community. I think we should. I think it's really interesting to see what's happening. Well, that's been really fascinating, Matt. I mean, and I think just so everyone to understand the differences in types of sector and the pace of change, and of course the implications of COVID. I mean, that goes without saying. I think before we wrap it up, there's some questions I've been asking my guests to set for future guests, so we can keep a momentum going on. One of the questions raised by my last guest was, how does one improve diversity in the education ecosystem in the UK? Any thoughts around that?
It's a really interesting question, and thank you, Caroline, for the question. I think technology can be a really good enabler in relation to getting more equality of access, more to learning generally, and also to getting students engaged. And in an assessment context, and I think if you think specifically about formative assessment, which I'm a huge champion of, and we can do an awful lot, as Sparx demonstrates, with data insights around student progression. If we can get students who normally are not that engaged with their learning process, often part of the reason for that is because they just don't know how they're doing, and the education system isn't really giving them the right kind of feedback to allow them to engage within their own journey moving forward. So they don't really understand how far they're actually progressing. Because even a student who has lower abilities is still moving forward. And often that is lost in translation with the overall low grade that they get, but actually they've advanced from a previous even lower grade to that grade now. So I think data insights, the data insight the technology can provide through formative assessment activities, through platforms like Sparx and others, I think is tremendously powerful and really starts to drive at getting that equality of access and more diverse engagement from students, regardless of their backgrounds, socioeconomic background.
Absolutely. Getting the equity right in the industry is so important. And I think the more we can do, the better. And I think it's getting there, but I think there's a lot to be done yet.
I agree.
I would give you the opportunity now to pose a question for a future guest, which you'd like to be answered about the education sector.
Okay. So I was pondering a little bit about this, and I want to couch this question, if I can, with an example. So one of the things that technology can help us do in assessment is approach what we are assessing in a different way. And the pandemic actually made people take stock on that. So an awarding body in the health and safety space called NEBOSH, their leading assessment, they ran into a real problem that the pandemic created, which was they couldn't assess the students who usually went into test centres to be assessed.
That's right.
They realised that actually by moving the assessment online, they were able to approach the assessment completely differently. And so they moved from what's called a closed book assessment to an open book assessment. And open book assessment is basically getting students to explain their understanding of their knowledge and then apply that knowledge into a certain scenario. And it's been hugely successful. And has really positively impacted on the students who are going through that and on the curriculum. So, very long-winded intro to my question. I'd like to know what if people were in the position of being able to dictate education policy and curriculum policy, what would be the one thing that they would do to make, to the benefit of students, to make them more employable?
Okay.
And I guess, looking back at that NEBOSH example, they made a change that made a positive impact for their students' employability prospects by making them focus on stuff they needed in the workplace.
Yeah.
So what do we change in our current secondary school curriculum to make students more employable?
How do we improve employability? That's a brilliant question. Matt, on that note, thank you very much. I really appreciate you having you here. It's been great. And for those, some of you may know, Matt and I used to work together before, so it's really nice to see you again.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you very much for inviting me. A real pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for listening in again. What a great session to understand about where we are in assessment, what's happening in the UK and the wider world, and the different parts of the education system, and of course the implications of COVID and the pandemic have had. Thank you very much for listening in. Hope to catch you again soon. Thank you.